Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Professor John Roberts, University of Wolverhampton. Welcome to the next in the series, public lectures for the Marie Curie Fine Art program, the ITN, the Innovative Training Network. That is the future of European independent art spaces in a period of socially engaged art. And we're very pleased to have as our speaker this evening, Massimiliano Mollona, who you may know of, who's been working in the area of socially engaged art for at least 15 years. I would be right, would I, Massimiliano? Yeah, around 15 years.
Yeah.
Massimiliano is a writer, a filmmaker, an anthropology based at Goldsmiths College, London, where he actually teaches anthropology. His practice is situated at the intersection of pedagogy, art and activism, and focuses overall, we might say, on the relationship between art and political economy. Now, he's conducted extensive field work in Italy, the UK and Brazil. His work in Brazil in particular, in the steel town Volta Redonda, documents his engagement with the workers in the town's steel mill, one of the largest in the country, in Brazil, and also engages with the local population whose lives are dominated by its economic power and its history. His book, Brazilian Steel Town, Machines, Land, Money, and Commoning in the Making of the Working Class, published in 2020, deals with that extensive fieldwork. Today, however, he'll be focusing on his recent book, Art Commons, published by Zeb Press in 2021, and we'll be looking at, as I just said, his extensive involvement in socially engaged art over the last 15 years, with a particular emphasis upon his involvement in the Institute of Radical Imagination. Now, Massimiliano, or Mao's lecture, will last for around an hour, and then we'll have a Q&A after that. If you want to direct a question directly to Mao, then please put on the hand sign. Okay, thank you. Anyway, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, John. I will start with sharing my screen and thanking you for inviting me to give this talk for Fine Art. It's a wonderful group and it's a wonderful project, so I'm very grateful for your invitation. And the title of the talk, Art Commons, Internationalism, Post-capitalism, and the Radical Imagination, refers to the notion of art commons that I developed in the book, and which I'll talk a little bit in the first part of this talk. Also the aim of the book was to sketch a general theory of commons, agency, and art, based on some practices and ontologies of movement, creativity, and beauty that are celebrated by non-Western society, but also in the Black radical tradition, to mount a critique of alienated political economy of life under capitalism. So in a sense, the book brings together art, anthropology, and political economy. That is my background, really, and particularly focus on the relationship between art and capitalism. So I want to give some definitions. First, I define capitalism as a movement of systematic abstraction and reification of life that culminates in its capture by the commodity form. That is to say, there is monetization of all that is human and non-human. And in a class system that is divided between those who make a living out of other people's labor and those who survive by selling their labor power. Entangled with imperialism and colonialism, capitalism is a violent process of occupation devalorization, and annihilation of life based on the social construction of a racialized and sexualized other. That is to say, every capitalism is racial and patriarchal. And private property, there is the enclosure, especially enclosure of movement, as I will discuss later, is central to capitalism. And this is a little sketch that I do when I teach at Goldsmith of the relationship between enclosure, capitalist movement, and in kind of dialectical relationship with the commons. So I define Western political art using Claire Laberge's definition as an historical attempt to bypass the condition of life under capitalism by decommodifying it. Or as John Roberts says, quote, avant-garde is the recurring name we give to the conflict between free artistic labor and capital, end quote. So like John and like Laberge, I'm interested in looking at art through the categories of political economy. But they see art more as dialectically constructed vis-a-vis capitalism, both inside and outside the commodity form. And because of this in-betweenness, art is potentially disruptive. But I see art as internal to capitalism and integral to its functioning. To think of aesthetic as a form of decommodification reflect a certain aristocratic and elitist logic of distinction, I use Bourdieu, based on replacing ugliness with beauty, material enslavement with abstract contemplation, and competition with a hierarchical system based on spiritual enlightenment, but which in fact provides a condition for capital social reproduction. For me, the emergence of art and aesthetic signals the historical transformation of capitalism from primitive accumulation based on direct violence to a biopolitical regime in which value is extracted to a combination of scarcity and beauty. Hence, I consider art as capitalism double, and the bourgeois ideology of aesthetic as a separate realm of life is the double of the bourgeois ideology of the separate realm of economics, and the figure of the artist as the double of the homo economicus. Besides, as David Lloyd described in his recent book, Underrepresentation, aesthetics is also a racial system, the experience of formal beauty in the global centers being entangled and dialectically related to the opposite feeling of compassion, empathy, to the opposite experience of abject and wilderness in the global peripheries, and wilderness that can be sublime and generate feelings of compassion, empathy, and sexual arousal. So instead of considering aesthetic as a space separator dialectically related to the everyday, I look at it in the atomical, the elemental, neither the human or the post-human or the anti-human, but at the infrahuman level. So also following the kinetic theory of art of Thomas Nail, I define art as movement of matter, as matter that flows and folds over itself in habitual patterns and cycles of dynamic equilibriums, of images that emerge as regional stabilities in motion. And aesthetics is the space of the encounter between humans and the world of images in flow, which we access not only visually, but through all our senses. To imagine art as movements of matter allowed me to do a series of conceptual operations. First, to the link art from human agency, especially representational art. Here we have human subject located in ever-shifting environments of which they have very limited control and even consciousness. Subject here do not create something from nothing, but are created by the environment. And the issue of attention, attunement is central. You can think about the artist as a receptor, someone who redirects, mediates, and refracts what is already there. An empathic carer or a sailor who folds the forces of the wind, the tide, and the light out of movement. Secondly, I delink art from beauty and link it to biopolitics. I define biopolitics as a process through which the borders and boundaries of human life are negotiated. Biopolitics always entail violent processes of institutionalization, that is, of neutralization of flows and movement, of life enclosure. Simmel spoke of money as a capitalist technology of ossification of life. Biopolitics in modern human terms as geontopolitics, as for the anthropologist Elizabeth Povinelli, there is the conflict between living and dead matter, or between agents with different degrees of animacy. The king treats the subjects, the capitalists the workers, the colonialist master the black subjects as inert matter, matter without life, or having stilted development, or being at the edge of movement. And I'm interested in biocapitalism from the point of view of Marxist form analysis. That is, how capitalism captures flowing matter and entraps it in solid forms and enclosure, which are isomorphic to the commodity form. And thirdly, I share the raw materialistic approach developed by Denise da Silva, in which aesthetic is a matter of life value, particularly of black life. Quote, if we image blackness as excess of matter, as disruptive force that cannot be captured, or substance without form, what would happen to the question of value? End quote. Value is a force in excess of capture that cannot be folded, cannot be contained, that cannot be enclosed. In this more than human level or infrahuman level, the distinction between nature and culture disappear, and the micro scale associated with the politics of the body blur with the structural and even planetary scale associated with process of mineral extraction, ecological depletion, but also of ancestral knowledge and ecological heritage. How would Trotsky's notion of an even and combined development look when observed to this long-term cycle of planetary history? So politics is a matter of institutionalization of forms, and art as a technology of form making. From this spectral, infrastructural, and trans-historical levels, how can we rethink the intersection of politics and aesthetics and the notion of political art? Art is what it needs to be done to keep life in movement. That's what Natasha Dillon from Decolonized Displays told me. Sometimes what is needed is redirection or redistribution. Sometimes it is a gesture of holding and folding, an opening, a partial closure, or a breaking down. In this section, I will talk about art and capitalism. I argue that by abstracting and freezing life through systematic enclosure of humans and non-humans, capitalism is a speculative process which creates value negatively and through its opposite, that is, through waste and annihilation. Example of capitalist enclosures, that the value what they enfolds are factories, private land, and intellectual patents. The negative and speculative logic of capital is also the logic of Western art, which defunctionalizes, neutralizes, and renders inoperative everyday objects and social relation by turning them into abstract, mental, or material images, commodity form. And if the violent physical enclosure of objects, nature, and people is the precondition for primitive accumulation, it is through the abstraction of art and unpaid labor of artists that capitalism, quote, puts the soul of the proletariat beholder to work. This is a quote, paraphrasing of Berardi. So Western art reflects and reinforces not only the operation of capital, but also share its imperial epistemology of separation. Western societies need to entrap and to create stasis. Ariel Azoulay described photography as a form of imperial enclosure. An enclosure of, when the shutter closes, it creates this enclosure in time, space, and in terms of relationality. And Western art originates in the moment when the flow and movements of matter are entrapped in stable forms, and when captured matter starts to be valued in itself, what David Harvey calls anti-value. I'm going to talk a little bit about anthropology and in relationship to the political economy of movement. So I also argue that outside capitalism, the human condition is experienced as relational flow, whereby the lives of people and those of non-human and their environments are deeply entangled. But as much as humans strive to enter the flow, they also fears oblivion and self-annihilation, and develop institutions and support structures, family, clans, congregations, markets, armies, or states that make themselves unique, memorable, and even immortal. Hence, they block the flow and cut the social network. But it is in the interest of the rich that these institutions are built to protect. So the autonomy and freedom of people and the closure of fixity of their institutions are in constant tensions, so that the outlines of personhood, the human agency, need constant redefinition through the lenses of religion, art, or economics. That is to say, it's impossible to have any society without institutionalization and without a struggle on the forms of this institutionalization. But anthropological literature shows that throughout history, commons have strived to challenge, break, and socialize the ossified human institution of kinship, clan, and states, the phantasmatic embodiments of capital, are then controlled by male elders. And the countering such movement of commoning, colonial capitalism has imposed even stronger and more violent boundaries and enclosure locally through various versions of the market ideology. The anthropology must have most understood the movement is a central component of how society are organized, of the political economy of life. In all capitalist societies, he described in the book, The Gift, it is believed that all organic and inorganic beings are endowed with movements and that objects and people should circulate openly and freely. In this context, gesture of permanence, gesture which put things and people back into circulation and keep the flow open, are more valued than gesture of impermanence. That is the productive gesture that carve objects, wealth, and individuals out of the relational flow of life. But these impermanent gestures and their agents remain invisible as they partake to a worldly movement. In other terms, in non-capitalist society, there is no separation with the so-called productive and reproductive labor, since they are part of the same principle of productivity or vital energy of the social. Unlike those societies, capitalist societies set a high value on this impermanent, quote, productive gesture that frees movement, blocks circulation, and cut relationship and build borders and boundaries. And this forced separation between productive and reproductive gesture creates an inverted relationship between human and things. Capital, that is money, land, machine, and commodity, is the invisible energy that puts human in motion. Labor consists of this human who, disentangled from circulation, emptied out of life, excluded from relation and left without movement, exists only in the abstract and lifeless commodity form. I will talk briefly about commons and then turn into the discussion about art and politics. The term commons can signify three things: a pool of natural or human resources, a community of people with reciprocal and sharing relations, or act of working together towards the reproduction of the community. But it is only when these three dimensions come together that we have the real commons. Commons also implies a specific form of participatory governance, collective monitoring and conflict resolution, self-determination, and nested levels of authority, reflecting the practical urgencies, the grassroots knowledge, and the embodied skills of the commoners. In spatial terms, commons are neither private nor public, neither collective nor individuals. They are relational threshold and space of radical openness, reflecting the autonomy of the collective. Commons, to use a definition by Stavros Stavridis, are words in movement. They are community that creates form of life in commons and that together produce and share and are continuously transformed. Commons is a modality of resting and dwelling in movement, to carve out and fold images and practices of friendship, comradeship, and solidarity out of the flow of matter. They are ensemble in movements, enclosure which remain open by resisting the disciplinary integration of capitalism. And anthropology shows the institution of the commons is universal and cross-cultural. And although commons have been endangered throughout history by colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism, they've nonetheless resisted, and not only on the basis of logic of survival or sustainability. On the contrary, they've developed powerful ontology of beauty, excess, and luxury, encountering the humanizing and belittling logic of capitalism. In fact, lurking in the background of the bourgeois ideology of artistic beauty and economic progress, it is a dry and desert landscape in which the vast majority of people put up with destitute, dull, and ugly existence. So with the notion of our commons, I want to reclaim an aesthetic and political vision of plenty for the future. The movement of the commons wants to break the ossified enclosure produced by the capitalist institution of money, work, property, and market, and the associated ideology of scarcity, competition, and self-interest. But commons cannot exist in isolation from capitalism. For instance, the egalitarian society described by Anthropology Class, Overing, and David Graeber, or the Zapatistas communities are not outside capitalism and the bourgeois state. Rather, they had carved zones of self-organization and autonomy within them. And likewise, as a mode of production and circulation, capitalism needs common in order to spread and grow. The socialization of productive labor by workers, of reproductive labor by women, or state redistribution. So I call the entanglement between capitalism and commons post-capitalism, which is the generalized condition of the contemporary world, which I'll describe a little bit later. I'll now talk about the relationship between commons and art and of political art. So there is a long history and entanglement between art and commons, from Russian constructivism to surrealism, the Situation International, Créolité, up to the even Andy Warhol's Factory, and more recently, socially engaged and relational art. The problematic aspect of this entanglement have been described by John Roberts: voluntarism, the externalization of politics and social welfare to the art industry and their cooptation by it, and also the temporal delay between when the political event happens and when it is captured by art. And once in capture, it becomes a capitalist spectacle, mainly through the ideological process of identification with the commodity form. For John, the fact that arts get involved directly in politics reflects the malaise of the lack of contemporary democratic mass movements. Here, I want to focus briefly on the paradigm of the art as organizer, which I consider an evolution of relational art, a term that was coined by Nicolas Bourriaud in 1992. Bourriaud described relational art as a space in between capitalism and the state, the ideology of the market of the former and the ideology of the public of the latter. In such in-between space, the value of art is impermanent, invisible, transient, and site-specific. Operating at the interstice of capital, art rejects the grand narrative of class struggle, sexual liberation, or anti-racism, which, according to him, are overdetermined by capital. He's taking an Althusserian perspective. The value of relational art emerges in fleeting space of dinner parties, of kindergarten playgrounds, or dystopian airport lounges. Relational art, developed by Bourriaud, reflect the so-called new spirit of capitalism described by Boltanski and Ciappello in their book. There is the values and practices of horizontality, teamwork, creativity, circularity as opposed to linearity, and quality as opposed to quantity, that the post-industrial and post-Fordist capitalism, the capitalism of the Silicon Valley starts up, has been developing since the 1980s. In fact, it can even be argued that it's precisely the institutional critique in art that developed around the 60s that it was the first form of prefiguration of this new spirit of capitalism. The more recent strand of participatory art is more politicized version than relational aesthetic. Unlike the latter, participatory art critically reflects on the power relation between artists, audiences, and collaborators, and seeks to break this through forms of co-production, reciprocal exchange, collective decision-making, and delegated performances. In the United States, participatory art followed the legacy of the civil rights movement, especially Black and feminist activist self-help processes, group discussions, and community work. I'm thinking about the work of Susan Lacy, and this is the wonderful 10 years long Oakland project in Oakland, California. Its main goal was to develop some form of participatory democracy at a time when national politics was dominated by the extreme neoliberalism of the Reagan era. Joseph Beuys' idea that performance was some form of living sculpture was still there, but the artists' concerns were political rather than aesthetic, and dictated by their self-perception as, quote, public servant, which is a term developed by Shannon Jackson, civil activism, and even NGO workers. This is a term by Irit Rogov. Typically, this is the art of Renzo Martins, whose socially engaged art consists in developing entrepreneurial schemes with plantation workers in Congo. This was also a trend associated with the artist as ethnographer, who was doing fieldwork amongst poor, migrants, underprivileged, casting an anthropological glance at the peripheries of the center. Take, for instance, the notion of arte utile developed by the artist Tania Brugueira. Here, the genealogy is clearly linked to the kind of Latin American conceptualism and the conceptualist avant-garde that developed in the 1970s, and that was linked to the anti-dictatorship movements. I'm thinking of Tucumán Arde in Argentina or Augusto Boal in Visible Theater in Brazil. One of the problems of this idea of politically timely art, which was the term coined by Bruguera and Bishop, is that is a problem that I often experience in my fieldworks in areas of political violence or of deep political change and radical political changes, is that by the time we experience politics on the ground, the wheels of history and the macroeconomic structure have already moved somewhere else. And so there is a temporal delay from what we experience and what actually it's happening at the structural level. So when artists like Bruguera capture the political moment, they create a use value for art that is still dependent on the derivative authorship and charisma of the individual artist and from the fast temporalities of late capitalism. And also the notion of art utile signaled the strange convergence between a kind of revolutionary materialist language of the historical avant-garde and the logic of the neoliberal museum, especially when the art utile was incorporated in mainstream museums in Europe. So gone are the public, the artist, the skill, and the autonomy, and they are replaced by the makers, the users, the goals, and the achievement. Gone is the bourgeois distinction between use value and exchange value, beauty and utility, art and life, and art become lives again, but inside an institution. Duchamp urinal is put back in the toilets of the Queen Museum, which you can see here. This is the counter Duchamp move that Tania Bruguera did by putting back the urinal inside the museum. But another version of participatory art is the paradigm of radical museology. This is a term developed by Bishop, emerged in the 2000s, also called fourth wave of institutional critique, in which mainstream museums and biennial instituted agonistic conversation and collaboration with social movements, such as the case of MACPA or Reina Sofia under the direction of Manolo Borja Villel, or even the experiment that I tried to make with the Athens Biennial in 2017, in the way I tried to connect it to grassroots solidarity networks. This transversal dialogue and para-collaboration between artists, activists, and mainstream art institutions including boycotts, occupation, and negative media campaign. But in this exchange between activists and institutions, something got lost. Art occupations that mimic the occupation of capitalism seem to be disempowering rather than empowering. Some art activists started to see themselves through the cynical eyes of the master as mercenary, parasite, freelancers, or quasi-institutions. Direct actions turn into negative freedom, which is a term used by Hito Stereo. Some institutional critique led to artistic gesture of reinstitutionalization, rematerialization, re-verticalization, and the nostalgic recuperation of the language and forms of the welfare capitalism of the 1970s, with postures that mimic bureaucratic, verticalist, brutalist, state-led, public and modernist form of art and politics. Artists morph into organic intellectuals, the bureaucrat, the party cadres, the engineers, or even the economists, and started to address the public with economic graphs, forensic reports, and climatological algorithms in dreary lecture performances, or doing boring administrative work in museums' back offices. Exception to this exhausted landscape is constituted by the wonderful work on solidarity economy by the artist Caroline Wooler, or the feminist economy of Cassie Thornton. But this melancholic return to the 1970s seemed to replicate the ghostly nostalgia described by Mark Fisher in Ghost of My Life. Here, the ghost of late capitalism incessantly returned in the shape of the music and fashion of the 1970s as a process of capitalist realism. That is, a way to escape the present by fetishizing the recent past, and in which historical memory is itself a form of cultural consumption. Today, this fourth wave of institutional critique, in which the city is both the locus and the means of political struggle is being suppressed by new capitalist reorganization based on accumulation by dispossession, land grabbing, and the militarization of urban policing. Urban commons are being closed down and replaced with segregated enclaves sustained by homophobia, racism, and paranoia. But under the contemporary rentalist regime, not all urban commons are closed. Cultural collectives, squads, self-managed theater, and housing cooperatives, instead of supporting, quote, rebel cities, which was the term that David Harvey described to the notion of urban commons and urban activism, they have become urban enclosures feeding gentrification, urban speculation, and global branding. The performance of criticality, civic activism, and occupation go to increase urban rents, so that urban activism, rather than being emancipatory artistic practice, constitutes a new form of alienated labor. With direct actions and activist artists being violently repressed by increasing authoritarian municipalities or co-opted by these new rentalist forms, participatory art retreated back inside the neoliberal museum, where it is now heavily curated and continues to respond to the capitalist logic of maximizing audience numbers. The museification of participatory art is increasingly overtly business-like, with neoliberal museums acting as incubator hubs of socially engaged art organizations, offering marketing, communication, and internal development services in exchange for ground rent and free programming. From the artist as service provider to the artist as service customer. As the anti-capitalism of artists and cultural workers is being either overtly repressed by Rhine-Weak municipality or co-opted into new forms of rentalism, it is important to ask what went wrong. Well, first, the activists emerging from post-occupy art, including some feminist groups whose valorization of reproductive labor is an important anti-capitalist tenet, failed to connect to the underpaid and precarious service workers, mostly women, ethnic and Black, and other social marginal categories. Besides, like relational art, participatory art was deeply flawed by the way it assumed social equality between artists and participants, so that in outsourcing their performance to the public, they reproduce existing class relations and alienated labor, and disguise their rent extraction as egalitarian and collective creativity. For instance, the work of the artist Santiago Serra, 160 centimeters line tattooed for people, where 4 prostitutes are paid the price of a shot of heroin to have a line tattooed on their back. And this is a work that denounced the intrinsic pimping and capitalist nature of art making. Yet, what there is to be liked by the impoverished working class audience in seeing itself reflected in the life condition of equally marginal people, as these are performative disempowered by the artwork. Lastly, the assumption that the precarious Western cognitariat is representative of the world at large proved to be highly Eurocentric. In the world peripheries, including peripheries of European centers, post-industrial labor is only a small part of the economy, which consists more often than not in heterogeneous and dystopic mixes of Fordism, informal subsistence economies, indentured labor, high-tech hubs, and service platforms invisibly connected by the global flows of capital. In conclusion, the failure of post-occupy artists is linked to the ethnocentric assumption that the post-industrial condition of the West is a planetary one. The next section is about the South. So with the organization of urban and national capital and the consolidation of the corporate model of the museum, cosmopolitan curators, institutional critics, and artists started to look at the South again for political inspiration. The South started to become the paradigm of the extra-institutional rather than anti-institutional, the grassroots, participatory, the post-political, the non-representational, the prefigurative. The South existing outside the horizon of Western democracy, neither in the market nor in the state, but in the street, to use a sentence by Juan Gaitan. It was noted that the biggest slums in the world, Delhi, Mumbai, Jakarta, Rio, were developing radical urban movements claiming the right to the city, and that these urban movements emerged as community-based experiments in which artists, researchers, activists, and migrants came together in hybrid institution or quasi-institution. This new search for the South was a variant of the artist-ethnographer paradigm of the 1990s. But instead of focusing on the national underclasses or indigenous migrant, this was a process of neocolonial appropriation in the form of institutional relocation, hierarchical integration, or corporate franchising, but framed as decolonial, post-colonial, or internationalist. Indigenousness, post-coloniality, Black activism, myth-making, rituals were all appropriated and spectacularized. Think of Documenta, the big art show in the world, which in 2017 was called Learning from Athens, and in which the curator cast Athens as a neo-colony of Europe and themselves as anti-colonial liberators, despite or because of the history of the colonial domination of Germany over Greece, but in fact generating a flow of mass touristification, gentrification, and land grabbing by German investors that further precipitated Athens' economic conditions. The second occupation of the South happened through the art market, in the revaluation of Black art, especially portraiture, by Sotheby's and in mainstream gallery, where identity is both the subject and the currency of the art market. And the third kind of appropriation of the South is happening through corporate franchising and institutional cloning. Take, for instance, the Guggenheim Museum, which developed a huge branch in Abu Dhabi, using its construction site entirely South Asian migrant workers with a system of indentured labor called kefala. The Guggenheim Museum is only one of the several franchises of Western cultural institutions, including the Louvre, the British Museum, and even New York University, that the United Arab Emirates is developing in the happy island of Saadiyat as part of its process of nation building and consolidation as a global center of shore capitalism. But this neocolonialism has generated also new forms of activism, such as the Gulf Labor Coalition, funded by a group of artists around Andrew Ross and Walid Rahad, to denounce the precarious and exploitative labor condition of indentured laborers in the construction site of Guggenheim. So Gulf Labor Coalition was a coalition of artists, but also a campaign and anti-sweatshop movements in the art world that combine social research and forms of direct action. According to Ross, labor activism in the art sector is much more effective than in the service and industrial sectors, because in these latter sectors, capital can quickly close down and relocate, whereas museum sweatshops are permanent fixes of capital and are hence vulnerable to ongoing labor action. So here there is a little bit of a description of a confrontation between the Gulf Labor Coalition and the Guggenheim Museum, which started in 2010, after the Labor Coalition sent out a call to artists to withdraw their participation in the museum, including the sale of their work, until the labor standard issue was addressed. Initially, the Guggenheim was open, but then started an ongoing confrontation that led to several strikes and occupation of Guggenheim in New York. And in 2015, the late Nigerian curator Enze War invited the Gulf Labor Coalition to the Venice Biennale, where they read out the report that they had commissioned on the labor condition of the workers. Another forms of really important activism is the one that decolonized displays led Amin Hussein and Natasha Dillon are conducting in New York, especially around the Strike MoMA campaign. The important thing about this campaign is the way it combines struggles against capitalism for struggle for decolonizing, especially decolonizing the Palestine occupied territories. And the way it brings together transversal conversation between cultural institutions, museums, and anti-gentrification and environmental, labor, Black, and anti-colonial struggles. In other words, this is a campaign that first operates on a transversal scale and secondly, operate on a global scale. For instance, Strike MoMA was initiated as a coalition of activists, called a group of activists called the International Imagination of Anti-National, Anti-Imperialist Feelings, and started to lead a protest outside MoMA in April. But this protest connected communities across Palestine, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, Colombia. And of course, the campaign was mainly targeting the several MoMA trustees. We know about Leon Black, who stepped down because his association with the sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, but also Stephen Tannenbaum, who made huge profit from the debt crisis in Puerto Rico, but is also has stakes in a weapon conglomerate called General Dynamics, which manufacture MK-84 bombs that were used to bomb Gaza. So there is this, let's say, activism against the board and against this kind of corporate nature of art that is connected to anti-imperialist struggles and to struggles against gentrification in New York. So now I'm now going to talk about the Institute of Radical Imagination, which is an organization that I co-founded with a group of intellectuals, scholars, lawyers, artists, curators, cultural producers, and activists, whose aim is to define and implement zones of post-capitalism in Europe and in Europe South and the Mediterranean. So the main issue here is how to avoid really the capture of militant art and militant cultural production by late capitalism. And the aim of the Institute is precisely to create militant research intervention, so to combine research with activism. And there is the epistemological angle is, of course, very central to IRI. And here, the idea is to look at culture as a kind of political movement away from economically bound location, which bridge across economic divides and cuts across classes. A culture that can produce and sustain an outside of capital. A culture as an horizon of the commons, as a contact zone, a zone of encounters, a dwelling. But more than Western culture, the issue here is on knowledge and epistemology. What kind of knowledge supports activist lives? What constitutes a communist epistemology? What is the relationship between militant aesthetic and militant knowledge? What kind of imagination epistemologies in images, language, or simple gestures supports life in commons? And what constitutes epistemology in action or movement? That is, what kind of knowledge emerges by doing and is entangled in everyday practice. So with this idea in mind, we started to develop a kind of relationship between epistemology, art, and activism, which is central to the Institute of Radical Imagination. Our militant research is based on long-term activation of strands of research that we develop internally, but also in collaboration with social movements and grassroots organizations across the nodes of IRI. So IRI has got several nodes in Southern Europe, in Naples, Venice, Milan, Madrid, Athens, Istanbul, and Cairo. So let's say that IRI wanted to address the lack of political imagination and freedom of experimentation in the art world, and to build a communal imaginary and epistemology as a starting point for transitioning in post-capitalism. So after we had already developed four strands of research within IRI, one on alternative economy, on care, on revolutionary art, on pedagogy. But after the School of Mutation, we started to focus on specific strands that we decided to, let's say, feed to our interlocutors in the nodes of IRI, to the social center and the social movements in our node. So the institutional angle is also very important for IRI, because the recent rise of right-wing populist and neo-fascist forces, the crisis of neo-municipalism, and the emergence of authoritarianism and the liberalism in Europe and the Mediterranean have put progressive museums and cultural organization, and also their transversal collaboration and socially engaged program under intense public scrutiny, and exposed them to accusation of squandering public money on anti-public activities. In addition, drastic cuts in public funding to arts, culture, and education have polarized the ecology of art and cultural production between corporate museums and smaller startup organizations seeking support from new aggressive private subjects, art foundation, patrons, NGOs, or working on the project-based logic of corporate museums, often by filling the public programs. In this polarized landscape of art and capitalism, medium-sized organizations are not only economically, but also politically unsustainable, because they are undermined both from below by critical narratives, horizontalism, and consensus collectivism and identity politics, and from above by sheer monopolistic power and corporate violence. Yet the space in between is precisely the outside of the current structure of cultural production under capitalism, and it is on the outlines of this outside to capital that the Institute operates. So we imagine that IRI could be an institutional threshold, an intermediate zone between museums, urban commons, and university, with fluid forms and multi-scale borders, marked, at least initially, not so much by economic and legal boundaries, but by common culture and the common imagination. The temporal also angle of IRI is very important. As I was saying, the issue of politically timely art is quite problematic. And so most of the time, I was saying that art can only come after the fact, after the political event. And the real political job of art happens at the level of political prefiguration or imagination, but also in long-term processes of institutionalization. So it is important not only the moment of resistance associated with the temporality of social movements, but also the moment of prefiguration and of constituent institutionalization to operate in the middle term. So by escaping the capitalist time split between the immediate and the apocalyptic future, the temporal politics of the Institute is invisible, dilated, submerged, indivisible, and unquantifiable. And something, quoting something that John wrote, it's a withdrawal from the centripetal pressure of the moment, a stepping aside and stepping back from, a withdrawing, a disappearing, and finding the renewal of speech in silence, end quote. So let me tell you briefly, before I quickly touch on the Zapatista Forum, what I mean by post-capitalism. Post-capitalism, I mean both as an epistemological framework, that is to say that, as I was saying before, the economies of late capitalism are diverse, are queer, are hybrids, and this heterogeneous mode of production create complex class configurations. So in the global south, we don't have the working class or the precariat, but a multitude of women, young migrants, Black, indigenous, and other dispossessed citizens who survive on informal reproductive labor and precarious economies. But likewise, in the global north, we find the capitalism that is totally entangled in reciprocity, mutualism, solidarity, and solidarity economies. As David Graeber says, capitalism is a bad way of organizing communism. By the term post-capitalism, I also mean the prefigurative political economy and anthropological imagination of socialist Western philosophers such as Peter Kropotkin, William Morris, and the Marx of the ethnographic notebooks, who consider small-scale society on the margins of Europe to be models for instituted commons and post-capitalist forms of life. So there is this idea of transhistorical, transgeographical nature of the commons. And also in solidarity with the Black radical tradition, I'm thinking about Cedric Robinson, but also Denise da Silva, I define post-capitalism as a non-ethnocentric and non-Eurocentric socialist ontology, free from the Enlightenment and Western Judeo-Christian ideology of catharsis and revolution. But more importantly, the Institute develops a set of policies and this research intervention that I described before in the field of post-capitalism, particularly in these fields that are here. So the demonetization of the economy through forms of parasitical finance, currencies of the commons, sharing platform, decentralized autonomous organization, the decommodification of labor through forms of cooperativism, subsistence economy, reproductive commons, and informal and popular economies, the legalization of space. We have been working a lot on obviously on the relationship between space, mobility, and inequality, with initiative of legalizing the common, and on the socialization of care, including towards a modern human world. And now I wanted to quickly tell you of Zapatista Forum, which we organized in Madrid and just finished on Monday, which is a series of events, research intervention that we organize in Madrid in collaboration with social centers of the Node, but also in collaboration with part of the Zapatista community. As you know, the Zapatista contingent arrived in Madrid on the 13th of August of 2021, 500 years after the conquest, and they are now traveling through Europe. They arrived not to fight, not to, let's say, recriminate, but they arrived to tell us that the struggle is continuing, and they arrived in support of the struggle that are happening in Europe. And this is some photos. These are some photos of their arrival. So, and this is a mural that the Social Center in Madrid wrote as a welcome to the Zapatistas. The important thing is that the Social Center has been organizing and liaising with the Zapatista community for several months, developing line of research, of inquiry, and of intervention together. So that when they arrived in Madrid, there was a lot of activism and activities going on. But we ourselves, as IRI, organized this series of intervention, these 5 days of series of intervention, which is called On the Precipice of Time, Sovra el Precipicio del Tiempo, in which we developed several strands, but these strands were basically coming out from the research we've been doing with the School of Mutation. But these strands were also a result of conversation that we had with Social Center in Madrid and with the Zapatista community itself on these strands of this line of inquiry that are also, of course, forms of insurgents' life that are practiced among Zapatistas, but are practiced also among various autonomous communities across the world. So particularly practice of insurgent learning, the notion of revolutionary cinema, cinema as assembly, raising care, and Art for UBI is a campaign that IRI started several months ago, and then now is there's a microphone open. Sorry, there's a microphone open. Oh, thank you. And so, for instance, this is the exhibition on revolutionary cinema that we developed with the curator Natalia Arcos, the Chilean curator Natalia Arcos. We try to work with the Social Center in Madrid in conversation with the artists from Chiapas to think what was the kind of state of revolutionary cinema in Chiapas, and the coming together, especially of the aesthetic and of the cosmologies of indigenous and Zapatista militants. And so there is a long, let's say, curation around both different historical moments of Zapatista filming and contemporary filmmakers from Chiapas that are not directly involved in Zapatismo, but obviously are in close relationship. And these are parts of the exhibition, and this is a Mayan cruz, which was empty at the beginning, and sadly we had to add the photo of a Zapatista activist that was killed a few weeks before the starting of the exhibition. A film by a Mapuche filmmaker, also very strong politics of autonomy in these films. And this is the learning station of the Skłodowska in collaboration with Free Home University. So there was an open learning station, the Skłodowska, that developed various pedagogical experiments in dialogue with Zapatismo, and made 2 films around these pedagogical experiments. And this was a learning station that we set up in the same center. This is a series of articulation of all our intervention. And this is a last communication of the Zapatista that shows that basically the global action continues, and there will be an ongoing series of activation of the Zapatista autonomia across Europe. So to conclude, I wanted to show that this Zapatista Forum reflects the new kinds of internationalism, which, let's say, operates in temporal, geographical, and relational threshold. So here, the internationalism, it's a connection between, let's say, the local dynamics, but that comes from conversation and long-term research that happens across autonomous zones, across social center in Madrid, across the nodes of IRI, and in the Zapatista community. So in terms of movements, IRI seems to be a porous institution that is carved out from these autonomous movements, the local movements of social centers and indigenous community, but also the transnational and transregional movements of Zapatismos across Europe. And by holding up these movements in a space and a history that are not the linear space and the linear history of capitalism, it seems to be managing to prevent these artistic activities or curatorial activities or research activities to be captured and closed by art, by the market, and of course by the state and the police. I want to stop here. Thank you.
You're just on mute, John.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thanks enormously for that, Massimiliano. There's a lot of material to digest in that. Before I open the discussion up to everybody, I just like to ask a couple of questions myself. One about your direct involvement in the production of socially engaged art. Firstly, as a director of the Athens Biennale, but also through your involvement in the Institute of Radical Imagination that you touched on briefly. It would be great if you could give us your perspective on the problems of doing that kind of work. You know, all the tensions that you've touched on already between art activism and activist groups, a relationship between the institution and the public sphere, and so forth. Could you say something about that through your own personal experiences?
Yeah. Well, in a way, there is let's say the tension are the one that I discussed, in the sense that when art directly get involved in politics, there is a temporal problem, which is basically that the temporality of art are very short term and very commercial, very market oriented. So basically they have to capture a political event, and they struggle to do that, or they create political events that are not really there. So there is an ethical problem, let's say, in thinking about what really means political art or politically timely art. When does it happen? And so in that way, my main struggle has been to try to create institutions that are long enough to sustain an involvement that can follow a political process over a longer periods of time, let's say. So there is a temporal dimension. And there is an institutional dimension in the sense that political organization that operates according to the principle of the commons are, let's say, unsustainable, as I was saying, both economically and politically. So you always depend on some kind of, let's say, it's very difficult to match the kind of economy of the commons to the politics of the commons, and so and ultimately then that becomes an empty exercise. So to transition, in order to be political, an institution has to transition into post-capitalism. It cannot talk about post-capitalism. It cannot only just be a post-capitalist social movement. It has to transition into a post-capitalist entity, which means to transform its own economy and social relations. So this is also very difficult. I think a temporality and the kind of economy that constrain all my attempts were a problem. With the Institute, that doesn't seem to be such an issue because there is a lot of awareness of these questions, let's say, and we're working together to solve these contradictions.
Okay, thank you. And one other question before I open it up to everybody else. You've talked in some detail in the lecture about what you see as a new decolonializing epistemology at work. I was wondering, in the kind of projects you're engaged with, but also across the rapidly transforming terrain of socially engaged art itself. I was wondering whether you could say a few things on this new agenda, in particular the influence of somebody like Sylvia Wynter's work on this new agenda through, I think, people like Fred Moten and Bonaventura Sousa Santos and Ariella Uzeli, who you mentioned, and even Denise da Silva. Do you see a shift there?
You're just on mute.
Sorry. Yes, I do see a shift, but also see a difficulty in the way this conversation are being, captured in some kind of institutions that are still quite restricted institutions. So there is actually, this is something we discussed at our pedagogical meeting we had in Madrid, where we were in conversation with a series of decolonizing institutions, la Universidad de la Tierra and other global networks. And the decolonizing movements is an important movement, but it's important also that exits the elite institutions. And so in order to do that, I think that I see, for instance, an opening in the kind of things that Decolonize This Place is organizing, the campaign Strike MoMA, where there is a real attempt to bring together the decolonizing discourse with networks of activists who work on specific campaign, but also to think what decolonizing means once it's intersectionally rethought through the struggles of communities in big cities So how you translate this decolonial paradigm that it's conceived in a very specific intellectual setting to real struggles. But I do see a very powerful convergence of the decolonial with these forms of abolitionism, for instance, and these forms of urban activism that are very intersectional.
Okay, thank you. So please, does anybody have any questions for Mao on any of the issues that have been discussed so far, or any other issues? Karen, I can see your hand.
Yeah, thank you, Mao, for your great talk. I have a similar question to John's first question. If I understood it right, you had a kind of critique about the museumification of socially engaged art. And my question here would be, since you also run an institute, I don't know what status it has exactly, the Institute of Radical Imagination, but how do you avoid a museumification of socially engaged projects and activism there?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I mean, the institute is run collectively, so we have a general assembly, and you know, it's got many people and many speeds and many bodies. At the moment, let's say that our strategy is to really think about ourselves at this institutional threshold. So we really are very aware of any kind of incorporation into cultural institutions or into, let's say, straight activism. And actually, it's not that a lot of us are activists. So it's not that we don't, let's say, support activism or not support cultural production in museums, but we are trying to really create this space where we are in between all these spaces. And so we really kind of nearly refuse specialization, but we are part of these three, you know, of these three contexts. And myself, I come from university. So for instance, every time I realized that my activity could be used for the university, I actually cut the connection with the university so that none of my activities are publicized at universities. So there is a way in which we are all aware that it's very important to create these spaces in between. Slowly we are also trying to contaminate people around us with this logic. And our methodology comes out precisely from that kind of ways of operating. So if we were not, let's say, both independent and pertaining to all these three realms, we wouldn't be able to operate in the way we operate. In the sense that, you know, for instance, with the Zapatista community, we didn't do an event where the Zapatistas were necessarily to be present. We engage with the ideas and the practice of Zapatismo. We engage with their ideas, but we develop our research, and then again we engage with communities that were engaged with them. We also engage with them, but the point was to create this space that was outside the possibility of capture by any of these point of view.
Thank you.
Do you want to add to that, Karen, or are you happy with the reply?
Yeah, I'm happy. Thank you.
Okay. Michael O'Connell, do you have?
Yeah. Thank you very much, firstly, for the brilliant insights in the presentation. It's just a kind of general question about political history, really. You know, at the time of, say, the bourgeois revolutions centuries ago, it seems to me that definitions of what art was emerged at that time, and also the situation as it developed was reflected in the kind of work of writers and artists, let's say. In a situation now of developed or late and seemingly quite insecure capitalism, is it not possible also that the definition of what art is begins to shift again, and not only in its necessarily being described as socially engaged, but conceivably other kinds of works too, which would not be characterized, which could not be characterized simply as, say, capitalism's double, but would reflect the dialectical contradictory forces at work, regardless of the ideologies of the producers. So that's my question.
Yeah, I think it's possible. I mean, I take your more as a comment than as a question. I mean, I agree. What is the?
So the question is, why this seeming focus only on socially engaged and participatory work in relation to what's got agency politically, let's say? Yeah.
No, you're right. I mean, these are kind of, I guess there were kind of categories that are already historical, and I was trying to make a connection between that kind of history and the idea of commons and the work I'm doing on commons and post-capitalism. I was trying to make, in fact, to create some kind of maybe less art specific and more like anthropological understanding of what political art is. So in my talk, I used them that very recognizable historically, but I was interested more in looking at this relationship between commons and art from an institutional perspective, let's say anthropological perspective. So yeah, I think that ultimately is about the different configuration in which capital and commons take, and which art, let's say, intersects with this struggle, let's say.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Alexei, you're next.
Yes.
Alexei? Yeah.
Yes, do you hear me?
Hi,
Yeah.
Alexei. Yeah.
Hey, hi, Mao. Yes.
Hi.
Thanks again. Thanks for your presentation. Actually, I wanted to say to everyone that it so happened that I read bits of Mao's book, not all, I have to confess, but just mostly theoretical part of this book, which I was mostly interested, not historical part or about these sort of contemporary struggles. And I have to say, I really recommend this book because I have to say it's very, maybe it was a draft I've read, not maybe this complete version. It might be slightly different, I don't know, but I've read the bits. But I have to say that this is a very interesting contribution also to the sort of theoretical debates about what art means today, what socially engaged art means today, political art means today. So, and Mao has, I'm sorry, calling Massimiliano Mao, as many friends call him like this, and the perspective is very unique in the sense that Mao brings his own work as anthropologist into these debates. So of course he refers to these commonly kind of accepted theoretical references about contemporary art or modern art, since, I don't know, Adorno or Benjamin, to contemporary debates, but he also brings this sort of interesting anthropological moment, which is also based on this sort of anthropological perspective of a kind of sympathetic observation and taking aside all these sort of assumptions we have before, right, entering this sort of into this connection with sort of situation or object we are trying to think through, etc. So I think it's a very interesting book. And I was reading, as I said, just part of it, but I think it's more kind of very much rooted in also this practice Mao is doing. So I think it's very interesting. Also, the second point is that very interesting because somehow this is a book that has a strong theoretical element, but at the same time is very much rooted in this practice, which Mao is navigating through using these theoretical tools, using his kind of very vast network. I don't understand how he manages to somehow to work with all this crowd of people within the Institute of Radical Imagination. I'm also being a kind of sleeping observer of these activities, but I think it's incredible work as well. So I think these two parts are kind of working well together. But I have also we're saying all these good and nice things. I just wanted to ask maybe a kind of couple of questions, because again, it's because of my interest, which was again somehow sparked through this Mao lecture, which was really interesting and theoretically interesting. So I am interested in this, how to say, relations. Many previous participants of this discussion, they also asked the question about art and capitalism. And I remember this chapter in your book about art and abstraction, which has actually quite a strong thesis, which I think might be kind of debatable, like that art is somehow just a continuation of this sort of a technology or technique of extension of this capitalist abstraction or producing commodity form, right? And you also stressed in this, in your paper now, the same point. So I think I also very tempted to look at art in this way, and I think it's quite radical perspective. But again, you also, of course, you mentioned these dialectics of somehow that art tries to be distinct from this commodifying force of capitalism, struggles, conflict. You mentioned also other theories thinking about this relation of conflict between art and this sort of pressure or coercion to be part of this gentrification, commodification, etc. So but this first part seems to be more convincing, because other part, okay, art is conditioned to be this sort of part of this capitalist machine, right? Conditioned to be a kind of technology, which also somehow you bring this anthropological argument in your book, also considering this in relation to ritual, to these various practices of separation, creation of isolated objects, which art usually is, what we see in the museum or in gallery, isolated objects or recorded performances, videos, all this world of separation, isolation, and alienation, which is actually, when we enter a museum, we see only this silent or shouting or whatever, but
Alexei, could you ask your question? There's a lot of people
so
waiting.
my question, that my first part of this argument seems to be much more convincing, and second part, actually reiterating previous question, second part seems less convincing. Why art should sort of resist this commodification? What is driving force of this resistance, right? So this is, I know many artists, and from practice I know this, that people are really subjectively resisting this logic because they are conscious, because they are politically educated, etc. But what is inside of art somehow makes it sort of a positional force. And also another question, I have a lot of doubts about this notion of post-capitalism, because it's somehow based, I think, on Italian tradition of this sort of post-negrist tradition about this idea of that gradual immanent transformation of society based on these movements, and rejection of this idea of revolution and rupture, right? I think this, but I think we could continue, but I don't want to take too much time. If Mao could respond maybe to first point about this, his theoretization of art.
Yeah, well, first, thank you for the kind words. And I have to say that I have to confess that Alexei and also Angela are ERI members, not very active, but they are ERI members. So maybe you are biased in thanking, in, describing the book in such a positive terms, but I thank you because I identify what you said. I think what I was trying to avoid in the book is to talk about art in this kind of universal terms. I was trying to show art as a kind of sets of thinking and practices that really emerges in a specific time in history, and mainly in the West. And then we can think about also the way in which navigate and travel around the world. So for me, it's impossible. There is not a dialectical issue. So me, art is not in dialectic with the economy or with life. It's part of capitalism. There is not a dialectic relationship, and I think the dialectic is precisely the kind of Western thinking that I was trying to criticize or to reconstruct in my anthropological approach. In the sense that the dialectic for me is a result of putting things into box and then trying to make this box traveling. And so that's for me the dialectics. And I was thinking that although in a sense it's impossible not having institutionalization of thinking and not thinking about something in terms of art, but there are, the majority of the non-Western, let's say non-capitalist context, and I'm talking about Western and capitalism together and linked to this anthropological framework, there is not dialectic because there is not a space of art. So that's what I also was meaning, and because historically that was not built also, in relationship to the economic structures where the relationship between art and capital is developed in the West is very different. So I wanted to try to get out from the dialectic approach, which at the beginning I was describing, and trying to have a more anthropological and, let's say, global perspective. And yeah, the second thing, I agree with post-capitalism is a very soft term. If you look at Gibson Graham or it's a very policy oriented if you think about it in terms of policies, like Paul Mason. But I think strategically it's a very good term because it is the kind of area where you can push policies and you can push actions, and that is tactically a good term to endorse.
I mean, why not to say communism?
Sorry.
Okay.
Why do you say communism?
Alexei, we need to move on. Sophie, okay. Do you have a question? Hi, Sophie.
Hi. Thanks so much for your talk. And especially, I wanted to ask a question actually about the Zapatista event that you mentioned, and connect it maybe back to, you mentioned when you were talking about the Institute of Radical Imagination that culture can function as a contact zone, which I'm assuming is a reference to Pratt, to Mary Louise Pratt, and this kind of, which obviously has been critiqued for the risk of disbalance or power dynamics that come into play. And I was just curious because I'm involved with the Zapatista delegation coming to the Netherlands. And one thing we're negotiating is how do we not reduce their visit to a kind of performative contact zone, which is, I think, also something I guess maybe in your critique of the kind of Eurocentric approach of drawing from the South. So just curious your reflection on the tour or how maybe to navigate those risks.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, let's say that I didn't meet the Zapatistas in Madrid, and the Zapatistas were there before this event started, and they would be back after. And for us, the condition for generating this research and this series of actions was not the physical presence. The condition was that we would connect to them on the level of struggles, of thinking, of researching together. So it's precisely that what we avoided is precisely this kind of events where we welcome the Zapatista in the exhibition or welcome the Zapatista somewhere. We didn't do that. But we kept on having conversation, often mediated by people, with them and through them. So yeah, I think you can develop a practice of being in a threshold, which is not dependent on locations and it's not dependent on a sense of historicity that are Eurocentric. I mean, for instance, we started with the idea that Zapatistas would come and go, and then the idea is that actually they will stay, and we don't know for how long they stay, and that maybe there will be an ongoing actions or series of conversational struggles after that. We don't know, and we're just open to conversation with them, to coordinating with them. But yeah, I don't know if I've answered. I mean, IRI didn't organize an event with Zapatistas, in which we presented Zapatista. They came with their own objectives, and we were lucky enough that they connected to what we were doing, and we could have that conversation on, for instance, what themes to put, or 6 months, 7 months before. Also, thank to Natalia, who's here, who's been living in Chiapas and has got great knowledge of Zapatista filmmaking. She's worked there. So thanks to this conversation, also we were able to work on something that was kind of substantial. It was not just for the event.
Thank you. Maria?
Thank you. Thank you, Mal. Brilliant thoughts. And perhaps as an extension of our ongoing conversations, I was struck by your response to Karen's question about musification and the question of the where. And we discussed once, and I argued in my own lecture a couple of months back for the tactical manywhere. In other words, the positionality of with, within, against, always, at the same time. You kind of reactivated a notion of the interstitial spaces in between. This is what your response was, and I'm of course fascinated about that. But I wanted to bring it together with one of your last slides where you talk about post-capitalism as policy demands. I'm absolutely fascinated by the notion of policy and perhaps left-wing consultancy, a complex term that probably would need unfolding, but we don't have time for it. But my question would go, if you operate in between, where do these policies go? Can you really, without working with, within, against institutional infrastructure, really bring policy to life and essentially change your prefiguring with these policy demands? So this is a slight contradiction that I kind of sense, but it might be my misunderstanding, and I would like to kind of correct that. So this is basically my question, how those two really come together.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, okay, so the issue of policy is very important, and I can see what you mean. But when we talk about policy, for instance, for UBI, for Art UBI, we talk about the tension between politics, or between campaigning, and between between that aspect, social movement aspect, and then the idea of setting on a, let's say, proposal that has to be actuated through a state institution or a museum. For the UBI, for instance, now we are going through this contradiction. At the moment, we are having a campaign, and I actually am pushing to try to think about policies. But obviously, the policy of UBA goes through, typically a state, which is a centralized state, can create even more dependency on the state. So you're right. At the end, you need an institution to think about policy. I think that there is a long-term possibility that some institutions that we know as they are now will actually crumble, and so that there will make some space for the activation of policy, even without museums, or even without without municipalities that are essentially very authoritarian. I mean, yes, the interstitial is something that I was mentioning in relation to Bourriot. I don't know how good this term is. I agree with you that this idea of being in several places at the same time, it's more productive. But yes, there is in a way, what I feel is that the moment, especially after COVID, with the collapse of so many institutions around us, with this kind of, speed through which government trying to pass UBIs or, of really sustain life. But I slowly I can see that a lot of institutions around IRI are struggling, either from a university or from the cultural world or from the world of activists. And IRI is having this kind of its own propelling force precisely from the collapse of many of these institutions. So staying in between could be a good way also of seeing what happened and to see what kind of aggregation we have, institutional aggregation from these areas where we overlap with. But yes, I think you made a very important point about the where.
Thank you, Maria. Gabor?
Hello, thank you so much for the presentation.
Hi.
I can absolutely join to Alexei's comment, although I would actually stress the importance of reading the book through the end. First of all, around page 116, you would even find Alexei's thinking or referencing for Alexei of his thoughts on post-communism. And so thank you so much. I was thinking about asking a question, but then I just saw that in the chat there was a question way before I raised my hand. So I think it's only fair if I read that out loud now. So the question from the chat is from Atri, I believe. Thank you for the brilliant presentation. What is the theoretical framework you have used for the juxtaposition of aesthetics and politics? How have you traced the development of these theoretical notions that inform your research?
Well, it's a kind of combination of anthropology, political economy, and art history. That's a combination that I'm trying to bring together. So and mainly the intersection, let's say, that between discussion on the relationship between aesthetic and politics, discussion about the commons, and let's say anthropological thinking around relationship between art and economy. So these are three strands that I've been working on: art and economy through anthropological, let's say, thinking, and also obviously a relationship between aesthetic and politics. But let's say that anthropology is a way of dealing with contradictions. So there are contradictions in the thinking, around the fact that art should be political for a start. This is an assumption that it's already ethnocentric, but I also trying to undo that assumption through anthropological approach and saying, trying to show how these sets of conversation and institutions are both specific to the West, but also kind of cross-cultural. So my attempt is really to try to create a theoretical framework that is cross-cultural and that looks at commons as a way of thinking through art and politics, but not the commons that, let's say, it's not in the Western tradition, not in the neo-municipal tradition of the kind of commons that we know have been developing in Spain or Italy. All these are important contributions, but I try to look at the commons from the point of view of for a non-Eurocentric point of view. There's surprisingly, not many anthropology have done that, and so I think it's very interesting to avoid, to avoid this kind of split between political theory that let's say are Eurocentric and political theory that talk about decolonialism but then reproducing a certain, Eurocentric approach. So I'm trying to get rid of this decolonial as a kind of Western discourse or appropriated by the West. I'm trying to situate it in an anthropological framework that is more transhistorical, in the way that Massimiliano Tomba, for instance, speaks about history, this kind of series of reiteration of revolutionary thinking, practices of commons that happen in history and through time, but without specifically creating any kind of teleology. Sorry, I'm gonna switch on the light because I'm disappearing. If you give me 2 seconds, I'm gonna. Yeah, much better.
Thank you. Did you want to ask your own question, Gabor, or was that the question that you were preparing to ask?
Do we still have time? Okay, cool.
Yeah, we got 20 minutes or so. Yes, 25 minutes.
Great. My question was like you mentioned in the book Art Commons that capitalism as a cinematic mode of production, and that we can also follow or I checked the Zapatista IRI event where you have a text or an unpublished manuscript called Cinema as Assembly. So my question is, or the first part of the question is, how does it possible, or in what ways can we do cinema that it not reproduces the capitalist mode of production?
Well, the answer the answer is it's very difficult, and in my book I clearly say that's after my kind of film experiment I was very disappointed by film in general, but I think that with this project Cinema as Assembly, which is a collective of people who are looking at similar issues, like Elisabeth Povinelli or Denise Ferreira da Silva. There's also John involved, Natalia with filmmaking in Chiapas. I'm trying to think about film, beyond the images. So I'm trying to think about how images activate specific coming togethers, or how forms of circulation or distribution create specific value and economies of cinema. With Natasha Dillon and Amina, we are thinking about the notion of strike cinema. So what happened, if we do cinema as if the technology of cinema didn't exist. So in a way, I'm very interested in thinking about the kind of social relations that can be activated by images, not in a commercial way. And so perhaps there is a way to do militant cinema, let's say. There is a way to do cinema that's revolutionary without being nationalistic, or without being propagandistic, or without relying on the usual logic of identification. And I'm now thinking that there are ways in which cinema and social activism can be combined in producing, let's say, aesthetics and form of activism through cinema. Revolutionary aesthetic and form of activism through cinema. I think there is probably a way, but it's not self-explanatory. And I think what I'm trying to understand is, again, if I can create an institutional framework where both the research and the production of cinema operates at thresholds, operates with keeping things open, there is a sustainability, but there is not an economy, a commercial economy, that there is an image that is that keeps on being, keeps on being open and keeps on activating discussions. So yeah, I think it's possible to have militant cinema.
Thank you. Anja, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. Hi, Mao. Thank you very much.
Hi. Ciao.
We'll talk, sorry. Yes, I have two questions. I guess the one I would prioritize is you talked about anti-value beginning of your talk. My question would be, since we're talking about a biopolitical context which effectively captures life, even death, you would say, how can anti-value be established in that context at all? How can it be a drive? Because I find it a very fruitful concept, but I see this contradiction there, for me at least, between the biopolitical, right, which valorizes pretty much everything for capital, and then the drive to anti-value, which I can see in the commons, at least in the commons as politics. Because, so that's my one question. And the other question, because I haven't read your book yet, is when you talk about the art commons, and because you talked about decommodification and so on, do you define as commons, let's say territories, I mean, in abstract terms as well, territories that are taken away from the capitalist life world, or that arise somehow externally, so that you accept an outside, or at least a border to capital? So are they taken away, these commons, because since they're not the same as the public, domain, or the state, for instance, the state funded, whatever, because it can be either, and it can be something that arises at the border of capitalist activity, or it's something that is deliberately removed from valorization processes. So these are my two questions. Thanks.
That's very nice. It's very nice to see you, Angela, too. And yeah, very nice question. Yeah, well, I start with the second. Commons are, let's say, are within, they're taken away from capital, but they operate in tension with capital. So I think one of the interesting points of the book of the Angelist on Omnia Sunt Communis, precisely when he described this tension between commons and capital, because in a way commons very often are forms of enclosure too. And so how do you sustain that enclosures? How do you make commons not to become capitalists, not to become enclosure themselves? And so, and at the same time, how you sustain the an expanding commons with what resources. But yes, I would say that rather than being threshold, commons operate within the logic of the state and capital, and they create this space that's operate initially according to the same logic, but then create its own autonomy. And it's very difficult, as Massimo was saying, it's very difficult to keep the autonomy of the commons, the autonomy from capital, because there are ways in which you can do it. There are ways in which you can use the market to feed the common, but ultimately the dynamic has to be an expansive dynamic that from the commons conquer capitals rather than stays there. So that's the first thing that is very, there's something actually I would like to work on, because a lot of social centers, I feel, have not understood the danger of staying still, basically, and that basically capital is something that is going to eat you unless you expand. And the other thing, sorry.
But biopolitics, these are the two.
So the notion of anti-value was really referring to David Harvey, the idea, this idea that the enclosure is a moment in which basically everything that is inside is devalorized. When you create, you know, a market scarcity, and when you enclose something, it's, you know, it's a moment of devalorization. That's how David Harvey describes it. Of course, it's a valorization, economic valorization, but it's a moment of devalorization from the point of view of life. And I think this is quite consistent with this idea of, for instance, necro-finance or necro, you know, this speculation on the value of debt. And, you know, this is what actually I think Black radical theory add to the theory of biopolitics, to show that there is this anti-value in action is in the history of necropolitics and of you know, of money that is continue to be made on this destruction of human life.
Thank you, mate. Okay, we're gradually running out of time. Does anybody else want to ask a question? Any more questions?
Yeah, can I ask the question?
Yeah, sure, of course, yeah. Who's this?
Yeah. I'm Shiraz.
Oh, hi.
Hi. I wanted to ask about the difference between urban representation and rural representation in art. For example, Fatima Bhutto has criticized about the Bollywood movies, which used to show a lot of urban stories, I mean rural stories. But now with their neoliberal economy, they've changed to more promoting the upper class and the ideology of neoliberalism. So do you think, until now, I think the farmers brought up the issue of rural areas. Do you have any comments on the way the film industry has moved from representing rural people to urban people only? Thank you.
No, I mean, that's an interesting point in the sense that I think a lot of, for instance, cinema, the kind of tradition of revolutionary cinema was very urban based, and there is now, I mean, I'm talking about political cinema, there is now an interesting reconnection. I mean, obviously, even this distinction between urban and rural is kind of problematic, at least in the global south, where there are this, you know, phenomenon of kind of expansion of city in the countryside and Islamification of the city. So this urban-rural is quite problematic, but I think there is an interesting, definitely, movements, at least of political film, to link the urban and the rural. I'm just thinking about Amar Kamwar, for instance, wonderful work on rural activism. So, yeah, I think that's ideally, you know, there's this kind of distinction should disappears, because the urban and the rural are kind of politically, but also spatially more and more connected.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question. Anybody else? Okay. Fabian, are you still there? Fabian? Hello, Fabian? Oh, perhaps Karen, could you speak on this matter, Karen?
On the matter of the next talk, you mean?
On well, not on the next talk, but if people want to continue this conversation, then they're able to do so. And if you could explain how they could do so, that would be great.
Sorry, we usually have a platform, and there's a link. I don't know whether it's in the chat. Otherwise, I can put it in the chat. this platform enables us to group up and to chat in groups and more informal gathering, so to say. And I don't know whether Fabian said he will put it. So there it is in the chat. And yeah, we're happy to see you maybe later with a glass of wine in like 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you, Karen, and thank you, Fabian. Mao, do you want to say any final words before we finish?
Well, I want to thank everybody immensely for this really nice conversation, and yeah, for your feedback on the book and this conversation. And also congratulations for this amazing project. I mean, the Institute, is really premised on this relationship between practice-based research, and you put together an amazing network of researchers and practitioners and various institutions. It's an amazing project, FEINART. So yeah, I just wanted also to congratulate.
Yeah, and can I echo that by saying that I would hope that everybody would be in a position to read Art/Commons, but also if you get the chance, you should definitely read Brazilian Steel Town. It's an extraordinary piece of work. Anyway.
Oh,
thank you, Mao.
Thank you, John.
Thank you for your
Thank
talk.
you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody, for contributing.
Thank you so
and
much.
hope to see you soon.